we'll get started. In any case, we will just with a few of the introductions or the housekeeping while we wait for others to join. It's very nice to see you, well, sort of see you all, see you in name only today. Welcome everyone to our webinar and good afternoon. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. So for those of you who may not know me yet, my name is Gabrielle Echeverry. I am the Deputy Executive Director at Livre Canada Books, and I'm here today just to introduce the webinar topic, introduce our excellent speaker, Brian O'Leary, and to help facilitate the Q&A session that will happen at the end of Brian's presentation. So I'm your go-to person for any questions or issues throughout the presentation itself relating to the platform. So before we get started in earnest, I want to just review some of our regular housekeeping items as we do in most of our presentations, or most of our webinars. So today's session will be in English with simultaneous interpretation into French and should take about 60 minutes, including some time set aside at the end for your questions. Alors, la présentation d'aujourd'hui sera en anglais avec interprétation simultanée en français et devrait durer environ 60 minutes. Et nous avons prévu du temps à la fin pour répondre à vos questions. Pour accéder à l'interprétation vers le français, cliquez sur l'icône interprétation au bas de votre écran dans les commandes de la réunion. L'icône rassemble un globe et par la suite, sélectionnez la langue de votre choix. Ça sera en français, obviously. But for those of you who don't require interpretation, please leave the interpretation feature off. That will be your best bet. And if you have any issues with the interpretation feature or with hearing at all during the presentation, please let me know. So after the presentation is complete, we'll be taking questions, as I mentioned before, in both languages via the Q&A function, and that should also be visible on your screen. But feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll collect them for the Q&A at the end. And if you encounter any problems, again, with any of the platform issues, please contact me directly. J'espère que l'interprétation, la fonction d'interprétation fonctionne comme il faut, mais si vous avez des problèmes, s'il vous plaît, laissez-moi savoir via un message privé. Okay, so I think now that we've got this housekeeping out of the way, I think more attendees are here or have joined us, have made it to today's session. I'll begin with introducing the topic and with introducing Brian. So we're very pleased to be hosting today's webinar, which is providing insights on international library lending practices, as you know, for digital titles. As library ebook lending practices come under greater scrutiny by large multinational publishers, which Brian will get to in the presentation, our webinar will explore how international libraries are balancing increasing demand for ebooks from library patrons with the needs of small and medium-sized publishers like yourselves. So today's session is part of a larger project that will gather concrete information and strategies for publishers who are looking to increase their visibility and digital book sales in international library markets. And we've targeted some key markets for this project, which we'll get to in the presentation as well. And then the project will continue with a follow-up webinar with more detailed information and a bilingual report on the same topic, which will be published in late March. The final report and follow-up webinar will also provide guidance and tools for working with selected international libraries to ensure both the visibility of and access to Canadian titles, and both in English and French or translation. So we're very happy to have you all here today, and that your viewpoints and questions will help shape this project. Because this is an ongoing work research project, please feel free to continue to contacting me after this presentation is done if you have any questions or any other issues, considerations that you'd like us to bring into this work. So we're definitely not done after today's session, and we hope that we can continue the conversation that we've started here today. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Brian O'Leary. For those of you who may not already be familiar with Brian's work, he has been the executive director of the Book Industry Study Group in the US since 2016 and is the founder and principal of Magellan Media Consulting, which works with magazine, book, and association publishers to improve how they create, manage, and distribute content. Brian researches and writes extensively about issues affecting the publishing industry, including research reports on the use of metadata in the book industry supply chain, territorial rights in the digital age, and best practices in digital exports. He's written several reports on digital publishing for the Canada Books, and I will share links to those in the chat later or throughout the presentation in case anyone's interested in going back to some of those if you haven't seen them already. Okay, thank you, Brian. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you for the opportunity. And as you just mentioned, we're doing this in a, if not an unusual way, in a kind of an interactive way that is different from what we've done in the past. This webinar is going to give an overview of what we've learned to date, but it's also an opportunity to solicit questions, topics, and gaps, perhaps in understanding on the part of Canadian publishers when it comes to international distribution of ebooks. So I hope it's useful, but it's also the starting point for a continued conversation going forward. The overview of this project in miniature is we're trying to look at digital library markets in the UK, in France, Germany, Spain, and the US. These are markets of greatest interest for publishers in the Canadian marketplace. And there are also areas where Lever Canada Books has been very active in the past. We've been working directly with the organizations that manage library sales in those international markets, and we're going to be giving you at least a little bit of insight from what we've been able to learn over the last several weeks. We do want to share information about how libraries make decisions about what books they represent. The fourth piece is that we're trying to provide information that helps Canadian publishers with the marketing and sale of their titles. But essentially, the goal is to grow revenue throughout the marketplace. And then as that last piece, we want to respond to your questions today, but we also want to try and find ways to include topics that may not be on our radar just yet in the research that we're going to be doing over the next couple of months. So think about those as you pose your questions as well. There are several international advantages to library sales. I think one example is that global interest in both English language and French language content has been growing, and it's been growing both with direct sales as well as sales through libraries. There's a significant opportunity to use metadata to market books to libraries, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's an opportunity that some publishers are missing because either the metadata has not been written with libraries in mind, or it's incomplete in a way that prevents libraries or discourages libraries from test driving a book. Fulfillment costs for digital books is lower than those for physical books. It's easier to get digital books to different marketplaces. And there is increased interest in digital reading. It's not the replacement for print that as was once thought. I'm not sure that I was ever a huge advocate for print being replaced by digital, but it's kind of peaked in different markets, somewhere between 15 and 20% for trade, but a higher percentage for educational content. The penetration is highest in the US and UK, where we have some pretty good feedback to share with you today, but it is growing elsewhere, and it's worth staying on top of. But along with those opportunities, there are challenges. The partners differ by market. This is not a new phenomenon for anyone familiar with the work that Lever Canada Books has done in the past. There's a lot of folks to know. There are a lot of different ways to get visibility and sales in different markets. And part of our job is to document what those channels are and give Canadian publishers guidance on how to best exploit them. The business models sometimes vary by market. What works in the United States does not necessarily work immediately in the UK. There are some commonalities, but France, Germany, and Spain also are different markets and have different considerations. Those markets also vary in how sophisticated they are when it comes to managing digital content. The gap has been closing, I think, over time, and that's a good thing, but it's not these aren't all the same market with the same degree of digital savvy. IT infrastructure in some markets can be a block to innovation. I think that might be biggest in Spain right now, but this is also a little bit like sophistication, an area where the gaps are closing. And that uptake piece is lower in some markets. Whereas in the United States, you might see 20% as a floor for the share of digital books that are sold, and maybe even higher in libraries. Those numbers are probably half or less than that in some international markets. Gabrielle was kind enough to talk a little bit about my role at BISG. If you're not familiar with it, this is an organization that oversees standards and best practices for managing the supply chain in the US. We try to solve problems that affect two or more parts of the industry. We work very closely with BookNet Canada to align practices across the two markets, recognizing that that quite a bit of what we do in the US affects Canada, and quite a lot of the innovation in Canada is certainly something that's playing a significant role in the US. We also work with international organizations such as Editeur on implementing global standards, things like Onyx and Thema, and best practices. And we're in regular contact with library organizations, not just in the US, but around the world. And that's part of the reason we're happy to do this project with Libre Canada Books. There are four things I think that are general principles for digital sales, and these would be true whether we were looking at international library markets or not, but it's worth keeping in mind because these are opportunities. The first piece is that metadata matters, and that's even more true than is the case for physical books. We did a webinar at BISG earlier this year in October, where we had a representative from the New York Book Ops, which is the service arm of the New York Public Library, talking about how they make selection decisions to fill collection gaps. And one of the things she kept coming back to over and over again was that metadata matters. We think that librarians have a physical copy of the book, they're reading the book, they're trying to make decisions. That's not how most purchase decisions are made. They're based upon the metadata that's available about the book, the product descriptions, the age range for all of these things are components of metadata, as well as reviews of the book where they're available. It's critically important that you get metadata right, and the more robust it is, the more it's written and maintained for multiple channels, including libraries, the more likely it is that you're going to grow your library revenue. The second piece is you have to meet the needs of local trading partners. And that's part of the reason we have this project in the first place, is to try and outline what it is that makes sense when you try to sell in the US, the UK, France, Germany, or Spain. You have to understand those business models that are in place. And you also have to get the timing right. So meaning that, not every market is buying books at the same time or in the same way. Sometimes it's fairly well spread out. That's particularly true in the US, where the trade space in particular has lost a lot of its seasonality. There still is a first quarter or first half of the year, second half of the year differentiation, but books are coming out every week. Whereas libraries in the UK have a much narrower window that you want to try and meet. But understanding all of those things is really important to be able to sell books to libraries. And I would start and probably say 50% or more of the value is in getting metadata right. We're going to do kind of an overview of the 5 markets that we're most focused on, but I'm also going to come back and talk about some specific questions that we've asked of partners in the US and the UK to give you a sense of how much detail there can be available and will be available in the final report. So let's start with the UK. Metadata really has to go to both Nielsen book data as well as BDS, which is Bibliographic Data Services. BDS Live is a primary vehicle to get to libraries in the UK. And in both cases, you need to have accurate information that's relevant to the UK and Ireland. Even though you might be only looking to sell to the UK, there's an opportunity to pick up sales there because Nielsen and BDS are both covering those territories. The kinds of things you need to make sure that you outline is your supplier. If it's direct, if you're working through an intermediary like an Ingram Core Source or another vendor, you have to be clear about your pricing. And because you're working in international markets, even though you may have been using BISAC codes to identify the categories for a book in North America, that's the common standard in the US and Canada. You want to make sure that you've included thema codes because in all cases, UK, France, Germany, and Spain, they're going to be looking for thema first and maybe thema only. CILIP, which is the library professional body, is also a resource. There's a link here. They have a supplier partner directory that can be quite useful for you. CILIP is akin to the American Library Association or Canadian Library Association, an opportunity to share information within that market. They are not working only on behalf of their members. They're trying to make things work better for library members. Your companies that you're probably quite familiar with, ProQuest, EBSCO, Ingram, are all active in the US market, and Gardner's in the UK are distributors and can be helpful. But there's also an important consideration. UK libraries often have local budgets, and they may use that local budget in a bookshop for physical books or specialty suppliers such as Holt. So you want to be thinking about the kinds of books you have, kinds of libraries that you want to reach, if you're academic in nature, et cetera. And then working closely with either Nielsen or BDS to get into that marketplace. Within France, and not surprising, I'm starting here with it's critical to get robust metadata into the supply chain. Dilicom is the French clearinghouse, and PNB is a digital lending service. These are important vehicles for you. It's also useful to partner with the distributor that sells English language titles in France if you're an English language publisher. If they're familiar with France, they're also probably like distributing within other parts of the EU. An example is Gardner's, the UK distributor, which has a distribution center in France. And there are a couple of others, Pollen and OLF are also options. And those liaise with if you work with Dilicom, that could be a useful way for you to get visibility in the library market in France. A little bit of more information via PNB, which is a Dilicom offering. They provide metadata to French-speaking sections of Belgium and Switzerland. So even though you may be thinking about France, here's an opportunity to have visibility in parts of the industry that you may not have focused on directly, or where sales may have been smaller than you could spend time and attention on. It's worth noting that in Canada, Demarc, which is active in Quebec, is been trying to understand and work with French organizations to sell books. So Demarc, if you're already working with them, can amplify your work, and if not, a conversation with them may be a useful way to get started in the French language market. And a little bit like the UK, libraries do get their budgets from local authorities, and they may spend at local bookshops or distributors. Breaking through that is an opportunity to use metadata to make sure that your books are discovered. So it's people are not, if they're looking locally, at least make it easy through Dilicom and other services for them to know that your books exist, and you can buy them in digital form for lending at a library in France. With respect to Spain, Dilve supplies metadata to libraries. Here's a link to some of the background on it. We'll be including more and a deeper dive in the final report. Libraries often use local sources to obtain physical books, but the digital market is kind of evolving. Libranda, which is actually owned by the same parent company as Demarc, can be a resource for digital sales. So if you do have those conversations with Demarc, even if they're not the right partner for France, they may be, by going up the ladder through to Libranda, a resource for digital sales in Spain. Germany is an interesting market. It's got a long history, obviously, of not just library sales, but book publishing. And so the general take on it is that its infrastructure is rooted in a cultural, economic, and political setup that is highly devolved, meaning that it's highly local. So it's critical to have a partner for local supply. And we name one here, but we'll find some others and make sure they're included in the final report. MVB, which is ultimately part of the same organization that oversees the Frankfurt Book Fair and the Borsenwein, plays a central role in supply chain management there. Libri is a large wholesaler and distributor in the marketplace. They're both resources that you can use to get better traction for library sales in the German market. And Divabib, which is a digital virtual library, can be a resource. It's akin to some of the work that's going on in the United States to create kind of a national library. So it's a central resource, different from the history and the more local and devolved setup that is currently in place in Germany. But so too is MVB. So there's a little bit of push and pull with respect to how centralized or decentralized things are in the German market. And then the last country that we're looking at is the United States. It's probably more familiar to Canadian publishers than almost any other than Canada. Companies like Baker and Taylor, ProQuest, EBSCO, and others are distributing to libraries, and Overdrive and Biblioteca are the two larger firms managing access at a library level. There is honestly increasing complexity for lending models, much more so than is the case in other markets that we're studying as part of this project. There you can borrow, for example, a book that might have expire after 26 lends. It sometimes could be just 2 years, and independent of the number of times it's circulated, the license expires. There are many different models like that. With some controversy, Macmillan a few years ago, just before the pandemic, introduced the notion that it would restrict licensing of front list hardcover books for 8 weeks to one copy for libraries because it felt like it was cannibalizing print sales. They backed off that model relatively soon into the pandemic, feeling that it was not the time to restrict library access. There were a lot of good reasons for that, but it has not reintroduced it. But those kinds of things are happening with some frequency in the library space in the US market, and it's likely that they will continue. There has been experimentation with different ways to sell. A few examples, we have bundles. One example is readmichigan.org, which is essentially a collection of works from Michigan-based publishers about the state of Michigan. It's fundamentally a geographic model. There have been, through a variety of different services, unlimited simultaneous lending. This is often used for smaller books or collections from a publisher where discovery and purchase might be relatively rare. And so it breaks through the clutter and gives libraries content to circulate. It obviously has to be of quality and relevant to the audiences for those libraries, but it gives them content to circulate in a certain price. The other thing is maybe not simultaneously lending books, but permanent fixed prices, so that you're actually selling the ebook and giving permanent access to it, as opposed to limiting the term, limiting the number of lends, et cetera. And in the US market, I would certainly recommend the American Library Association as a resource. It's a very significant player. There are tens of thousands of different libraries in the United States. Most are members of ALA, and it can be a really good touch point for questions about the library market in the US. A little bit more about the US market, particularly given how large it is. I would underscore what I said a moment ago. Digital lending models have been a contentious topic for publishers and libraries. On the Publisher side, there's a concern with what is described as frictionless lending, the ability, for example, for a library to allow remote access to a digital copy of a book so that it can be downloaded or streamed to a device without uh, a user even coming into the library. Whereas on the library side, there's concern with what are described as exorbitant ebook prices. These are making budgets really difficult to balance with all the demands, both for digital and physical content. And this is a tension that has not yet been resolved, honestly. I would say this is mostly a debate between larger publishers and public libraries. There are innovative models of the sort I described a moment ago between smaller and medium-sized publishers, and also some just libraries that are willing to experiment, or in the case of something like Reed, Michigan, where there's a clear geographic link. So I don't think this is a hopeless situation. It's a complex one, and I think it will continue to evolve over the next several years. If I had to compare the five markets, which is a useful vehicle, they all have central metadata repositories except the US. That's something we're very aware of in the US market and are thinking about. But central repositories, particularly when you get your metadata right, can be a really valuable resource. If you think about the important role that BookNet, Canada, and BTLF play in their respective parts of the Canadian publishing landscape, the ability to both put your metadata in one place and have anyone access it is a real benefit. They all have active national organizations. They're different in nature. So, but the British Library, for example, plays a significant role in metadata standards and assignment of ISNIs, which are International Standard Name Identifiers in the UK market. Dilacom, Dilve, MVP, and these other markets are really significant as well. There's a little bit less of that coordination in the US market. It kind of falls a little bit to my own organization, the Book Industry Study Group, to pull people together. But we do it in a variety of different ways as well. I think that the two English-speaking markets may be the most innovative and evolved in that regard, but innovative and evolved is not necessarily the best thing. Innovative is also complex, and evolved might be that we've kind of reached at least a temporary peak or endpoint for how complex the industry is. The other thing that you've seen is that the markets outside of those two, US and UK, provide significant local control. That's also I mean, there is local control in the US. I mean, most budgets are raised for public libraries are raised by property taxes that are assigned locally. There are exceptions in different states and the like. But that also means that they're making decisions in a variety of different ways. But in all cases, however they make the decisions, quality metadata and a reliable understanding of it are often required. There is value, and this is an opportunity, I think, for Canadian publishers. We'll have more to say about it as the report is developed. But there's value in differentiation. It's a crowded marketplace. If you think about the global marketplace for books, you're talking about millions of new titles published every year. And single titles may get lost in the mix. We think that things like bundling and innovative business models, like essentially selling lifetime access or providing a clear pathway to lend multiple copies of a book when they're popular, could be a way to kind of break through the clutter. This sometimes requires software development, particularly in certain markets. But the US and the UK, being kind of advanced in terms of their IT infrastructure around digital lending from libraries, can be really useful vehicles in markets to help test ideas. So if you have something that would require development, more than likely the US or perhaps the UK has either already solved that problem or perhaps is closer to a solution and require less time and less investment to make that happen. And you can see whether the idea that you have in mind has legs, at least in those markets. So we have a set of questions. This isn't the full list, but we kind of picked the most important ones that we posed to some market experts, and the deep dive on this will be included in the final report. But I wanted to go through this and talk to you about the answers that we have in hand today from the UK and from the US. So one of the first questions we asked is, how do libraries learn about available ebooks? One of the things that you hear in the UK is that direct marketing from publishers is a tool. So kind of some of the traditional channels, if you have a sales force in a market, either writing or emailing or putting ads in publications that librarians read. Sometimes, particularly for higher ed, there are lectures that adopt a textbook for a course, or perhaps a supplementary text for a course. They put it on their reading list, and then the libraries almost automatically pick up some number of copies for that. So the opportunity to work with secondary and post-secondary educational institutions to get your book specified goes a long way. And then sometimes the partners that are in the market, so the BDSs, and the Nielsen's, can be doing some marketing on behalf of a book or a set of books or a publisher. And those are all ways that libraries in the UK learn about ebooks. ProQuest, EBSCO, et cetera, where they're active, can be really important resources. They provide a lot of information to librarians, much more so than is often the case. And there are also platforms like Ex Libris, where libraries have purchased software, and that software, Rialto, allows them to order books and to learn more about books. The key thing here is that librarians, much as I described the use case in the United States, are really looking to metadata and to third parties to qualify the books for them. There is some direct presentation from publishers, but the validation really comes from services and software that relies on metadata. There are a couple of things, reading lists, things like evidence-based acquisition and patron-driven acquisition. If you're part of the programs that kind of support that, it increases the likelihood of a library purchase. This means essentially you put in a queue, libraries know that you're available for example, for patron-driven acquisition. And if, depending on the terms of the deal, if somebody asks for a book and it circulates a given number of times, 2, 3, 5, depending on the deal, that at some point the library buys it. So being part of those programs can both increase visibility, but it also can increase sales. JISC in the UK has a library hub, Discover. JISC is a way to be aware of what other libraries are holding. Sometimes that can be a detriment to sales, because if the book's available through another library that you have access to, you can borrow it there. But it's also a good way to find out what's circulating in other libraries. In the US market, the question was really, how do you learn? And the feedback we're getting is it's not that much different from print. The libraries, particularly public libraries, are monitoring a variety of sources for information. They do look for reviews, high demand lists like the New York Times, fewer in number these days, but essentially media sources that show either popular or well-reviewed books. And it's also the case in the United States that subscribing to vendor created lists, the ProQuest, the EBSCOs, is an important piece of that list. The second question we ask is, do publishers market digital books in unique ways? And both the US and the UK said that they don't really see significant differences here. I think in the context of libraries, there are obviously different ways to market books that are physical in form, shelf talkers and the like for physical books. But for digital books in a library environment, there's not a lot. that's happening just yet. We asked if there's a preferred buying cycle during which the libraries research and order books. That's stronger in the UK, frankly. Right now, particularly at the university level, there's a September or there's a semester pattern. So they tend to look at books September to January and then February to June. The buying periods for those two operational windows are August and September, and then January and February. So you clearly have to have all of your ducks in a row in July for the August-September window, and then probably December for January, February. In the UK, they also pointed out that sometimes there's a smaller peak in June or July, as libraries which have local budgets or fiscal years that end at that time are looking to spend their remaining budget, and sometimes they're also successful at getting year-end appeals for extra funding. And if that kind of works on the local library level, in the universities, they tend to have a fiscal year that runs till the end of July. So if libraries have funds to spend at that time of the year, they often will purchase ebooks, so digital books, and the invoices will be essentially passed for payment before the end of the fiscal year, so that you're not dealing with the lag that sometimes occurs with the acquisition of physical products. Within the US market, there's no simple window in that regard, that it tends to be more spread out. I think that reflects kind of the change in the US market over the last decade or more to have less seasonality, and it's kind of playing out. I do think that if you're selling into the educational market, there is a window that's not that much different from what I've just described for the UK, but you have to be available. There are things like immediate or access that is kind of a given. They're finding a lot of US universities have found that when students do not have access to materials on the first day of school, that they almost immediately begin to have a skills deficit, and it's tied to things like more frequently dropping out of a course and or underperforming within a course. So they've made they paid a lot of time and attention to getting digital materials readily available for audiences for those classes. We asked if there were trends in demand for content from international publishers. Neither the US nor the UK saw significant evidence of that, but there was a response that demand for content from university presses outside of the UK. Excuse me, let me just take a short drink. Thank you. The university presses based outside the UK may be in greater demand. So this is an opportunity within the Canadian marketplace, potentially to put together bundles or to highlight university press content and at least test that as a potential opportunity. And then the last question that I wanted to try and cover today in a little bit more detail: any common mistakes that publishers make in selling digital books to libraries, so that we could try and warn folks off. Number one on the list, particularly coming out of the UK, was not providing high quality metadata, because it's metadata that drives discovery, both for the library and if you're selling into a higher education environment for the student. Metadata in the supply chain itself, which is typically Onyx based, really does need to be complete and accurate. Things like grade range and age range make a big difference there. If it's not accurate, then the library either is not going to find the resource that you have, the books that you're trying to market. And if it's inaccurate and they do find it, they potentially might purchase it and in error, essentially that it's not the right resource for them. So you don't want to go down that road. You're probably familiar already that Onyx and MARC, while compatible, are not the same thing. Libraries use MARC for cataloging. So once a book is published, or you have a book that's available to be published, it should be affiliated with a really coherent and comprehensive MARC record. Companies like BDS, Bibliographic Data Services, do that on behalf of publishers, but a good MARC record, a little bit like a Library of Congress record, is an important piece to getting a book catalog in a library. One of the most significant concerns that a lot of libraries in the UK talk about is having a relatively poor MARC record, which requires rekeying or amending. It forces libraries then to help users find resources that the library has access to but aren't properly described in a MARC record. One of the data points that was shared with us was that as much as 15% of all queries to help desks at a given library are effectively users having trouble finding the resource they need. It exists in the library, but it's not cataloged in a way that makes it discoverable. And then poor quality records within a library catalog generally typically have to be removed or updated. If you have a really big ebook collection and the MARC records aren't good, those are books that are generally not going to get found, not going to get discovered, and not going to get recommended for purchase. We talked a little bit about evidence-based acquisition and patron-driven acquisition. Those are important channels in the UK market, so making sure that you're part of those. And that also requires really good metadata, really good MARC records. A couple of things that are a little bit more specific but useful to know. One is if you put your book particularly into a collection and a digital book, it's possible to withdraw it at some point, but you really want to try and avoid that because people kind of build collections around that, often based on reading lists. So they've made a deal with whether it's BDS or through ProQuest or other sources. And if you pull a text, particularly at short notice, the patrons are going to go look for it. They're not going to have access to it. So that kind of sours the relationship with that publisher. There's a resource, KBART, that's maintained by NISO, the National Information Services Organization, that allows ebooks to be more easily discovered and accessed. And if you're familiar with it, Counter for libraries is a tool that's used to measure the use of electronic resources. So being counter compliant is really important. So those things came up pretty regularly in the US as well. So we had a few questions getting ready for this webinar from Canadian publishers, and they overlap a little bit with the things that I've already said, but I wanted to go through them in specific. One question was, how do we navigate markets as a small niche publisher? And I think I have three recommendations. The first, obviously, is metadata, both Onyx and MARC. Getting your metadata right, making sure that your book is accurately described, particularly from the standpoint of a librarian looking to fill a gap or have a book in hand that meets the needs of a third grader, an 11th grader, a specific academic purpose, etc. Those things are really important, and I think that people tend to forget it. So first thing is metadata. The second is to look at different bundling opportunities. If you're a niche publisher, you're probably focused on a relatively narrow range of books. Can you put those books together to make them, particularly at a given price point for a library, that makes them more appealing for the library? The libraries often have special interests or special communities. And then the third is to look at this geographic model. Potentially there are content that you have that would make sense for marketing in Germany or in France or in Spain, et cetera, that could be put together in a bundled way that makes sense for that market, and also kind of cuts through the clutter and gives libraries access to more content to circulate hopefully at a price that makes sense for them. There was the observation that pricing models are of particular interest, and as I've said in the course of this presentation, it's complex, and particularly in the US market. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time outlining those models, but they fundamentally break down to a specific number of lens before a license needs to be renewed, a specific time period, unlimited lending, bundled lending, geographic focus, and the like. And I think that this is an area where the U.S. leads, and I think in that it's probably the right place if you're interested. If you're interested in testing different things, the U.S. is a good place to start. If you're concerned about keeping up with the pricing models, the U.S. is probably a place to avoid. So, the question was, are libraries using the accessibility metadata available in MARC records? Frankly, we hadn't, when this question came in, we have not asked this of different partners that we've been talking to over the start of this project. We will include it in the future conversations. My immediate sense is that accessibility metadata is an opportunity more than it's a reality, meaning that publishers are providing relatively little accessibility metadata, particularly through Onyx. That's true not just of Canadian publishers, but really of publishers more around the world. And I think librarians are struggling a bit. DeMarc has done some interesting work that I heard a presentation of at Frankfurt Book Fair, and they might be a good resource for it. Generally, what's happening with ebooks is that the product record doesn't necessarily cover the accessibility metadata that you would like to, but it's embedded in the file itself. And DeMarc is looking for ways to try and query the ebook itself, the digital book, to be able to drive that. And I think that has significant potential, but it does belie a problem that we have in the publishing community, which is we're not really using accessibility, we're not providing accessibility metadata in a queryable way through Onyx or other mechanisms at scale. And that's a situation that does need to change. The question, and it's a good one, of how can a publisher increase discoverability, visibility, and digital sales in library markets? Top of the list is metadata. You have to recognize, particularly for digital books, but even for books, physical books, the librarians are not looking at the object, they're looking at metadata. They're trying to understand the book based upon the information that you provide and the reviews and other resources that they can access. Occasionally, they may talk to other librarians or to folks who already have the book, but reality is that you want to start and spend a lot of time thinking about how you make your book visible through metadata. And then the last question that we were asked is, how do universities or high schools buy ebooks for their students? I kind of covered that a little bit in terms of the information about evidence-based acquisitions and patron-driven acquisitions, but also reading lists within schools. So you have to, particularly at the higher education level, but also high schools, you have to get into the folks who are teaching the courses and get them to be both aware of your book and potentially to buy it. There are resources that you can use, and librarians do look to them. Teachers, particularly at the high school level, may not be looking at EBSCO, but they may be talking to librarians to say, well, what books are out there that can be helpful? So again, that comes back to metadata, I think, which is important. I wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about the next steps for the project and then take your questions. The first piece, we're going to deepen the research in these 5 target markets. We've really just gotten started. This approach is an interesting one. When Gabrielle and I first talked about it, I just said initially I would normally do the research and then talk about it, but this is a way to kind of give you a snapshot of where we are right now and to get your input early. And then we'll bring you back in March or thereabouts and talk some more about it again when the report's available. We're going to document the supply chain for discovery and purchase in each of the 5 markets. You'll see us identify other partners of value to Canadian publishers, and we have a final report due in March. We'll return with a second webinar that outlines any new findings and probably reinforces some of what you've heard today, and we'll do it with the report in hand. So we've got a chunk of work to do, but I think we've made a good start, and I look forward to hearing what you have to ask today.
Thanks, Brian. That's great. I have, oh, here we go. We have a first question already. So it's from Brush Education. Do you have any tips for setting library prices for these different markets in Onyx?
No, and part of it is because I work in a trade association, as does Gabrielle, and in general, we're trained to not tell you about pricing. I would say more generally, you want to be looking at the bands of prices that competitive products are already asking. And if you're changing the business model, so for example, if you're giving unlimited access and you're the first person to, or the first publisher to offer that or to test drive it, generally for unlimited access, you can charge a higher price. For a bundle, you can charge for a higher price, but it can't be, it's not necessarily multiples. It has to be within a range. I think the other thing that is important is that you want to make sure that you express the pricing in local currency. Sometimes this is easily forgotten. I think it's more commonly forgotten among US publishers than Canadian. But you know, if you're going to sell in France, you obviously want to be talking about euros. If you're going to be selling in the UK, you're talking about pounds, and in the US and dollars, et cetera. And I think that finding that right price locally might not be comparable. And as you start to look at other markets where prices are typically much lower, India and the like, if it's not part of our study, but you may need to change your paradigm for how you charge for content in those markets.
That's a great reminder. We definitely have questions like that about from different markets, and that aren't these Western, like the US, UK, the big, and Germany, of course, big markets. How do you price for places like India or Morocco? Those are things that we are constantly being asked and also asking ourselves. So that's great.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a thought is you want to remove as many barriers to purchase as you can. So the thing, sometimes markets will pay in Canadian dollars or a non-local currency, but make it easier is generally the rule of thumb, and it does create headaches for any publisher who has to reconcile currency valuation changes, but you want to selling the book is the most important outcome.
That's great. I don't see any other questions right now, so maybe while we wait for other people to type their questions in the Q&A function, I could ask one of my own. And I think it's a little bit related to this, how to, not pricing necessarily, but how to work across these different markets. So, the emphasis that you have been putting on metadata, we're certainly hearing that here. And one of the things I think that, you're mentioning that some of the library, some of the markets that you've already spoken to have mentioned that, this is one of the biggest kind of stumbling blocks to making titles visible and accessing titles is not having proper metadata. Is there, for a smaller publisher who's maybe not used to or doesn't have all the resources available to create that metadata, are there other resources out there or standards country by country that are sort of can be found to help with that, with the creation of that metadata? That's just kind of almost, I don't know if the template would be the right word, but some sort of resources that would be helpful.
Sure. So I would say don't make it overly complicated, but I mean, and certainly BookNet Canada and BTLF when it comes to best practices with respect to metadata coming from Canadian publishers are important and really, really good resources. But putting that aside to try to be specific. So you want to get the grade range and the age range right. 0 to 99 doesn't help a librarian. And we forget sometimes that they're trying to make decisions based, as I said, on metadata. So finding a good grade range, a good age range for the products that you're selling is a starting point. The second is to look at your marketing copy and make sure that it's not written for a trade book publisher, as an example, but rather for the needs of a librarian. And there are options within Onyx in particular to be able to write a description for a specific market. And that would be a really useful thing. You should think about whether or not you want your marketing copy, even if you're selling a book in English or in French, in a market where English and French are not the primary markets. So Germany and Spain are an example. Do you want to be writing German language promotional copy? And can your distributor or partner, supplier partner in that market be helpful in that regard? Again, it kind of falls under that bucket of let's not make it harder to know about this book. Librarians who are trying to find an English language resource for their patrons themselves may not be proficient in English or in French. And so, taking steps to try and make it easier to make your book known within that market. And you probably have to make choices. I mean, it would be hard to argue even for a medium and smaller size publisher. They have a backlist or a front list to create German language, French, and Spanish translations of all of those might be hard. But pick the books that you want to test drive, see how doing that does. And we kind of make the same advice for things like keywords. You don't have to do everything, but pick something, test drive a different approach, and then see if it moves the needle a little bit. And I think relying on your partners in those markets, if you're working through a third party or working with a BDS in the UK or Dilicom in France, then having a conversation with them would be really useful to say, what kind of things move the needle here. We'll have some of that specific stuff content in the final report, but that conversation can go a long way.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I don't see any other questions here. Someone had asked earlier about a theme code, so I just provided a link to the general sort of theme editor, theme page. I think it was editor. And so this is that I think as also depending what you're used to. I think we have at Lever Canada Books have switched over to Thema ourselves in our rights catalog, because it was one way of kind of bringing together codes from both the Quebec market and from the English language market here in Canada. But it is hard sometimes to select what kind of information to provide and how to make that manageable across lots of different markets.
Right. I mean, I think Thema, there are better people than me to pitch Thema. I mean, we're responsible for the BISAC standard, but we do map to Thema. So if you use the BISAC code list regularly, we map to and the download package that we share maps to the current version of Thema. We're just releasing this week the new BISAC version, and so the map from that to Thema won't be available for a couple of months, but we'll make an announcement when it is. But it's a useful tool to get you started. It's not the answer, because there are vagaries in any mapping between standards that make it harder to rely on. But if you just think I can't take my whole catalog doesn't have Thema, take to get started, you can use the map, and then I would go back and check and say, does this really make sense? Just look at it, and if it misses the point, then you can kind of work with a smaller set of options. But the work that Lever Canada Books has done is really important, because what you're doing effectively is removing a roadblock to considering it. The librarian is going to understand, all right, this is a book about this. And so even if they haven't read the marketing copy, and they at least know what the theme code is, and that's familiar to them. So that's good news.
Mm-hmm. I think, Brian, was there another question you wanted to answer in the Q&A, or
do we have one? It looks like we have one. Or is this
I think
this is the question you're referring to, that we have our ebooks at Lightning Source. So should you have the thema code? Well, within you're probably providing, my answer would be, you're probably providing Onyx already, and if you're not, somebody is on your behalf, to lightning source, and they should be able to maintain both BISAC codes and thema codes in their metadata. So I would recommend, if you're anticipating sales outside of North America, so if you're using lightning source only for US and Canada, thema is probably a luxury. You don't need to go down that road. But if you're using lightning source, for example, to sell books in well, I should probably amend this, because lightning source would be a print option, but the answer I think is still valid. It's just not for digital books in libraries. But if you're trying to sell books in the UK using lightning source, or to sell books out of the UK to Europe using lightning source, then thema is more important, and it's useful to include in your records.
Okay, so I think we're at 2 o'clock, and I see a few people have had to probably log off and go back to their regular office duties. But if I think we have all the questions answered now. Again, as we mentioned early on, if you have any other questions or thoughts that you would like answered or considered in the next iteration of this project or the next steps of this project, please feel free to contact me and I'll relay those to Brian. And we'll try and see how they can help shape kind of the questions that we ask afterwards of the contacts that Brian will be working with in these different markets. But yes, as always, please stay in touch. We love to hear from you and let us know your thoughts. Brian, was there anything else you wanted to say before we log off for today?
Only that we really appreciate the opportunity to do this. We're in regular contact with many of the library markets around the world. And this is an opportunity, I think, to bring that thinking together and to share it with the Canadian publishing market.
That's great. Yeah, we're really excited to be working on this. It's nice. I do like also the sense of being able to do a longer project. It makes it feel a little bit more grounded, and like we're to be able to follow up. A lot of the times our projects are very short-lived, succinct, and so it's nice to have this extra time. So thank you all for joining us on this kind of experimental project, and we hope to keep hearing from you and provide the answers that you're looking for as close to as we can. So I think that's it for us today. If you can fill out an evaluation form, we really appreciate that. And if you have comments there, but also you can use that vehicle if you want to do something more anonymous for having comments or questions that we'll include in the final report. Please go ahead and use that if you're more comfortable doing that rather than emailing me directly. But we're always happy to hear from you, and we're looking forward to the next steps for sure. Okay. Well, thank you, Brian. We'll be staying in touch, and thank you everybody still here with us. It's great to see you, or sort of see you this afternoon. À la prochaine.